Wyatt Earp is one of the few men I personally knew in the West in the early days, whom I regarded as absolutely destitute of fear.
I was in the OK Corral at 2:30 p.m. when I saw the two Clantons and the two McLowrys in an earnest conversation across the street in Dunbar's Corral. I went up the street and notified Sheriff Behan and told him it was my opinion they meant trouble, and it was his duty as sheriff to go and disarm them. I told him they had gone to the West End Corral. I then went and saw Marshal Virgil Earp and notified him to the same effect. I then met Billy Allen, and we walked through the OK Corral, about 50 yards behind the sheriff. On reaching Fremont Street, I saw Virgil Earp, Wyatt Earp, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday in the center of the street, all armed. Johnny Behan had just left the Cowboys after having a conversation with them. I heard Virg Earp say, "Give up your arms, or throw up your arms." There was some reply made by Frank Lowry, when firing became general, over 30 shots being fired.
Among the most notable of Arizona's many exponents of the gospel of violence unto all men were the Earps, who early placed Tombstone on the map as well, deserving its cheerless appellation.
Of all the gunfights of the Old West, probably none is more famous than the gunfight at the OK Corral. Leaving aside the fact that the fight wasn't actually in the corral, this incident was so quickly wrapped in legend, myth, and outright lies that the truth is still difficult to find. Were the Earps really the unblemished heroes of dime novels and old movies? Or were they thugs who happened to wear badges? Were their adversaries truly dangerous criminals? Or were they just personal enemies, killed as part of a power struggle in an Arizona boomtown? The answers, as usual, are more complicated than the myths. But without question, Wyatt Earp and his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, were among the most legendary lawmen of the West. Wyatt Earp was many things in his life. A lawman, certainly, but also a gambler, a saloon keeper, and brothel owner. But before all of that, he was a young boy in Iowa who watched his older brothers James and Virgil and half-brother Newton go off to fight for the Union in the Civil War. Wyatt tried later to run off and join the army as well, but his father found him and dragged him back home. In 1869, Wyatt took his first job as a lawman, replacing his father as a constable in Lamar, Missouri. He married Uriah Sutherland soon after being elected to that post, but his wife died, probably of typhoid fever, within a year. In the years after Uriah's death, Wyatt's life was unstable. He was accused of fraud in Lamar and skipped town before that could be resolved. He was accused of horse theft in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, along with another man. His alleged partner was acquitted, but Earp never went to trial. From this distance in time, it is difficult to know what happened, but clearly, Wyatt's life was going in the wrong direction. His next destination was Peoria, Illinois, where he seems to have been an enforcer in a brothel house, getting arrested on multiple occasions. He may have done some buffalo hunting around this time as well. In 1874, he moved to Wichita, Kansas, where his older brother Jim and his wife Bessie ran a saloon and brothel house. He may have helped keep the rough customers in line for his brother and sister-in-law, and he also may have done some work dealing cards in the saloon. But his life started turning around after Wyatt helped an off-duty policeman recover a stolen wagon. He got some good publicity out of this, and in 1875, he was officially hired as a deputy marshal in Wichita. Wyatt was a big man for the time and strong. By all accounts, he was a respected officer in Wichita, helping to keep the peace. Not long after, he drifted to Dodge City, which was very much in need of good peace officers. Dodge City was a cattle town, like Wichita and Abilene, and in 1876, it was the busiest. Wyatt joined other lawmen there, including the Masterson brothers, James, Ed, and William Barclay Masterson, better known as Bat. Bat and his brothers were buffalo hunters turned lawmen. In June 1874, 20-year-old Bat was one of 28 men at the trading post of Adobe walls, who fought off a 4-day siege by hundreds of Comanche warriors.
The Kansas buffalo hunters invaded the Texas Panhandle in force in the spring of 1874. In 5 months, it is said they slew 100,000 bison. The deserted Adobe Walls was selected as the rendezvous for these hunters, who came from Dodge City, 175 miles away. The Indians formed a gorgeous and spectacular cavalcade. They rode 900 strong. The picked men of the Comanche, Kiowa, Shawnee, and Arapaho nations, the finest horsemen on earth, the best cavalry that ever went to battle. Glistening with war paint and decked in his battle raiment, every Indian believed that he galloped to certain victory. 45 caliber Colts were frequent. Winchester rifles and Spencer carbines were seen on every side, and sometimes Sharp's rifles. At their head rode the Comanche, Quena Parker. Fort Dodge, Dodge City, and Safety were 175 miles to the northeast, 1,200 yards across, carpeted with high blue stem, curtained by the breaks of the Canadian. The little valley of Adobe Walls furnished the buffalo hunters with an ample, sufficient, and glorious amphitheater for their fight against the odds of 30-1. Over near Langston's, Tom Keefe's little dog licked his face and awakened him to observe a herd of buffalo coming. Keefe lay on his elbows to watch them. As they walked out into the grass, Watson and Og glanced towards the herd, and suddenly, from the throat of one of the two came an appalling cry. The discovered Indians answered with the war whoop. The advancing herd of buffalo was transformed into a pack of yelling, screeching Indian demons. The hunters outside fired one volley and retreated within when the Indians were within 100 yards.
The defenders were spread out in the 3 main buildings of the settlement. 2 of the buildings had adobe walls 2 feet thick. The third had 10-inch thick wooden walls. Those strong walls would be tested, as the hunters were very nearly wiped out in the first assault.
Again and again, the Indians dashed against the doors of the building in the endeavor to break them down. Running at full speed, they hurled their horses against the defenses, or, whirling, backed them against the doors, hoping their weight would force an entrance. Long after the sun had risen in the heavens, they continued. 20 braves dismounted and attempted to rush the door. The fire from Langston's and the crossfire from Hanrahan's, where Dixon and Masterson had secured an advantageous position.
Despite their numbers, the defenders were able to use their superior weaponry, including a stock of Sharps rifles and ammunition in the trading post, to hold the attackers at bay for several days. By the fourth day,
over 100 hunters had crowded into Adobe walls from surrounding territories. For a number of days, they were surrounded, and the firing continued. But finally, the Indians withdrew. And on the morning of July 14th, the hunters marched out from Dodge City, which they reached July 27th.
the battle would have dire repercussions for the Southern Plains tribes. It would lead to the Red River War, a series of mostly smaller skirmishes between the U.S. Army and the Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, resulting in their forcible relocation to Indian Territory. Bat Masterson served as a scout for the Army during some of those campaigns. A few years later, Bat Masterson was in Dodge City. Dodge needed tough lawmen who could handle a rough crowd of cowboys without having to shoot them. The cowboys were both the lifeblood of the town and the bane of its existence. The town needed them living and at liberty so that they could buy drinks and lose their money to the card dealers. But the wild behavior of the cowboys kept the town from being respectable and was likely to get someone killed. On June 9th, 1877, the Dodge City Times announced regarding Bat Masterson's brother Ed,
Dodge City Times, June 9, 1877. Ed Masterson had been appointed assistant marshal of this city. He is not very large, but there are not many men who would be anxious to tackle him a second time. He makes a good officer.
It wouldn't be long before Bat joined his brother Ed as a lawman in Dodge. But at this point, in the very same issue of the Times announcing Ed's appointment, a second article featured Bat in a somewhat different light.
Last Wednesday was a lively day for Dodge. 200 cattlemen in the city. The gang in good shape for business. Merchants happy and money flooding the city is a condition of affairs that could not continue in Dodge very long without an eruption. And that is the way it was last Wednesday. Robert Gilmore was making a talk for himself in a rather emphatic manner, to which Marshal Larry Degger took exceptions and started for the doghouse with him. Bobby walked very much leisurely, so much so that Larry felt it necessary to administer a few paternal kicks in the rear. This act was soon interrupted by Bat Masterson, who wound his arm affectionately around the marshal's neck and let the prisoner escape. Degger then grappled with Bat, at the same time calling upon the bystanders to take the offender's gun and assist in the arrest. Joe Mason appeared upon the scene at this critical moment and took the gun. But Masterson would not surrender yet and came near getting hold of a pistol from among several which were strewed around over the sidewalk. But half a dozen Texas men came to the marshal's aid and gave him a chance to draw his gun and beat Bat over the head until the blood flew. Bat Masterson seemed possessed of extraordinary strength, and every inch of the way was closely contested. But the city dungeon was reached at last. If he had got hold of his gun before going in, there would have been a general killing. Ed Masterson accomplished his first official act in the arrest of Bobby Gilmore the same afternoon. Next day, Judge Frost administered the penalty of the law by assessing 25 in costs to Bat, 10 to Norton, and 5 to Bobby. The boys are all at liberty now.
Bobby Gilmore was a small man, whereas Marshal Larry Degger was upwards of 300 pounds. Bat couldn't stand seeing the marshal manhandling the little man. The mayor must have sympathized somewhat, because a month later, he remitted $10 of Bat's fine. And the town in general must have felt good about Bat, because just a month after the incident, Bat Masterson was appointed undersheriff of Ford County which included Dodge by Sheriff Charlie Bassett. Right around that same time, Wyatt Earp returned to Dodge City. He had worked the previous cattle season as a lawman in Dodge, spring and summer 1876, and had left for some months to go to Deadwood. Wyatt moved around quite a bit, but his return was clearly welcome, based on a July 7, 1877 notice in the Times.
Wyatt Earp, who was on our city police force last summer, is in town again. We hope he will accept a position on the force once more. He had a quiet way of taking the most desperate characters into custody, which invariably gave one the impression that the city was able to enforce her mandates and preserve her dignity. It wasn't considered policy to draw a gun on Wyatt unless you got the drop and meant to burn powder without any preliminary talk.
But Wyatt apparently didn't take the post right away, based on a report a few weeks later.
Miss Frankie Bell, who wears the belt for superiority in point of muscular ability, heaped epithets upon the unoffending head of Mr. Earp to such an extent as to provoke a slap from the ex-officer, besides creating a disturbance of the quiet and dignity of the city, for which she received a night's lodging in the dog house and a reception at the police court next morning, the expense of which was about $20. Wyatt Earp was assessed the lowest limit of that law, $1.
The exact cause of the fight between Wyatt and the muscular prostitute has been lost to time, but the incident highlights the rough nature of the town and the times. And the town fathers couldn't have found it too worrisome a story, because Wyatt was in fact hired on as an assistant marshal. It was during this time that he made his acquaintance of the man with whom his name would be forever linked, Doc Holliday. Wyatt himself later told the story in an interview with the San Francisco Examiner.
It happened in '77 when I was a city marshal of Dodge City, Kansas. I had followed the trail of some cattle thieves across the border into Texas, and during a short stay in Fort Griffin, I first met Doc Holliday and the woman who was known variously as Big Nose Kate, Kate Fisher, and on occasions of ceremony, Mrs. Doc Holliday. Holliday asked me a good many questions about Dodge City and seemed inclined to go there, but before he had made up his mind about it, my business called me over to Fort Clark. It was while I was on my way back to Fort Griffin that my new friend and his Kate found it necessary to pull their stakes hurriedly. Doc Holliday was spending the evening in a poker game, which was his custom whenever the faro bank did not present superior claims on his attention. On his right sat Ed Bailey. The trouble began, as it was related to me afterward, by Ed Bailey monkeying with the deadwood, or what people who live in the cities call discards. Doc Holliday admonished him once or twice to play poker, which is your seasoned gambler's method of cautioning a friend to stop cheating. But the misguided Bailey persisted in his furtive attentions to the deadwood. Finally, having detected him again, Holliday pulled down a pot without showing his hand, which he had a perfect right to do. Thereupon, Bailey started to throw his gun around on Holliday as might have been expected. But before he could pull the trigger, Doc Holliday had jerked a knife out of his breast pocket and with one sideways sweep had caught Bailey just below the brisket. Well, that broke up the game, and pretty soon Doc Holliday was sitting cheerfully in the front room of the hotel, guarded by the city marshal and a couple of policemen, while 100 miners and gamblers clamored for his blood. You see, he had not lived in Fort Griffin very long, while Ed Bailey was well liked. It wasn't long before Big Nose Kate, who had a room downtown, heard about the trouble and went up to take a look at her doc through a back window. What she saw and heard led her to think that his life wasn't worth 10 minutes' purchase, and I don't believe it was. There was a shed at the back of the lot, and she set fire to it. She also got a 6-shooter from a friend down the street, which with the one she always carried made 2. It happened just as she had planned it. The shed blazed up, and she hammered at the door, yelling, "Fire!" Everybody rushed out except the marshal, the constables, and their prisoner. Kate walked in as bold as a lion, threw one of her 6-shooters on the marshal, and handed the other to Doc Holliday. The 2 of them backed out of the hotel, keeping the officers covered, and the pair of them got away safely and rode the 400 miles to Dodge City, where they were installed with great style when I got back home. Such, then, was the beginning of my acquaintance with Doc Holliday, the mad, merry scamp with heart of gold and nerves of steel, who, in the dark years that followed, stood at my elbow in many a battle to the death. He was a dentist, but he preferred to be a gambler. He was a Virginian, but he preferred to be a frontiersman and a vagabond. He was a philosopher, but he preferred to be a wag. He was long, lean, and ash blonde, and the quickest man with a 6-shooter that I ever knew. It wasn't long after I returned to Dodge City that his quickness saved my life. He saw a man draw on me behind my back. "Look out, Wyatt," he shouted. But while the words were coming out of his mouth, he had jerked his pistol out of his pocket and shot the other fellow before the latter could fire. On such incidents as that are built the friendships of the frontier.
Wyatt Earp's fond image of Doc Holliday wasn't shared by many others. Bat Masterson later wrote of Holliday,
Holliday had a mean disposition and an ungovernable temper, and under the influence of liquor was a most dangerous man. Holliday seemed to be absolutely unable to keep out of trouble for any great length of time. He would no sooner be out of one scrape before he was in another.
Meanwhile, Bat Masterson was working his way to being sheriff of Ford County. His appointment by Sheriff Bassett as the undersheriff made it clear who Bassett thought was the best man for the job. Bassett himself had served a maximum of 3 terms. With that support, Bat took the office. For a short time, the brothers Masterson served together as lawmen in Dodge, till it ended tragically on April 9th, 1878.
April 25th, 1878. On the evening of the 9th, at 10 o'clock p.m., 6 pistol shots rang out on the south side of the railroad track. A party of 6 cowboys who had arrived in town in the evening had been enjoying themselves with dancing and drinking, some of them evidently getting too much liquor. Marshal Masterson and Policeman Haywood, being the custodians of the public peace, were present, prepared to prevent any disturbance or trouble among the boys. One of the boys, named Jack Wagner, got to be very noisy. About this time, the city marshal observed that he was carrying a 6-shooter, contrary to city ordinance, and proceeded to disarm him, which he accomplished without much trouble, and turned the pistol over to Wagner's boss, A.M. Walker. The dance went on, and all appeared to be in peace and harmony. The marshal stepped out the front door to the sidewalk, where he again met Wagner, and saw that Wagner was again in possession of his pistol. He at once attempted to take it from him. A scuffle ensued. A general rush was made from inside the hall to the sidewalk. Policeman Haywood stepped forward to assist the marshal, but just as he did so, 2 other cowmen drew their pistols upon him and held him in position. One of them snapped a pistol in his face, which fortunately missed the fire.
As Ed and Wagner struggled with the gun, it went off, shooting Ed Masterson in the abdomen. The shot set Ed's shirt on fire. Ed drew his own revolver and shot Wagner, then turned his aim to the man holding a gun on policeman Haywood and shot him as well. Both of the Cowboys died of their wounds, but so did Ed Masterson about an hour after being shot. Later, Bat Masterson arrested 4 other Cowboys involved in the incident which killed his brother. Ed Masterson was a respected officer, and his loss was hard for the city. The city council passed resolutions declaring their respect for him, and all businesses were closed for the funeral, which was the largest that Dodge City had ever seen to that point. But the following month, a notice appeared in the Wichita Eagle.
Wichita Eagle, May 16th, 1878. Wyatt Earp, well known in this city and for a long time connected with our police force, received an offer of $200 per month to take the marshalship of Dodge City, which he went up to accept, with all its dangers and responsibilities, last week.
Wyatt was going back to Dodge. Wyatt was hired as an assistant marshal under Charlie Bassett, who had moved from the sheriff's office to the marshal's. Working with Wyatt was another of Bat Masterson's brothers, Jim. Jim and Wyatt both racked up high numbers of arrests, primarily for offenses such as carrying a pistol, being drunk and disorderly, or acting in an angry or violent manner. Each arrest gave an officer a $1 bonus, so they took every advantage to earn that money. Wyatt, the Mastersons, and other law officers in Dodge had reputations as skilled gunfighters. Whether those reputations were deserved or not, in truth, they were not trigger-happy lawmen. They were well-practiced in the art of buffaloing unruly cowboys, which meant smashing them on the head with their heavy revolvers. Certainly, a harsh practice from the perspective of the 21st century, and probably from the perspective of the Cowboys. Earp historian Alfred E. Turner quoted a letter from S.D. Allen describing Earp in action as an officer in Dodge.
I will conclude my letter by relating to you the only story Father ever told me which concerns Wyatt Earp as a marshal in Dodge City. He said it was a typical arrest. My father and a group of friends were gathered around a billiard table watching a game when Wyatt entered the room and pointed at one of the number, saying that he wanted him. The man approached Earp and they talked for a while. Then Earp swung him around, searched him, taking a knife and a number of shotgun cartridges from him. Earp then pushed him towards the door, and the cowboy spun about and returned the compliment, whereupon Earp punched him in the face and dragged him towards the street. On the sidewalk, the prisoner began to struggle, telling Earp to let go and cursing him loudly. Soon they were fighting, and Earp butted the man and then tripped him, sending him sprawling into the street. Before he got up, Earp cracked him over the head with his revolver, opening a deep gash. A doctor had to be called to the jail to attend to the prisoner's head, and friends of the cowboy, my father was one, complained to the mayor about Earp's treatment of his prisoner, but got the brush off. I'm not suggesting Earp was a bully. He seems to have been a very brave and intelligent man, but I am pointing out to you that the reason he lasted so long was because he knew better than to allow his adversaries to get the upper hand.
This typical arrest does sound rough on the arrestees. But while those cowboys might have suffered aching skulls, they weren't bleeding out on the streets of Dodge. The saloon keepers and brothel owners certainly appreciated lawmen who could keep their clientele alive and spending money, and presumably those arrested would prefer being hit to being shot. In fact, there's only one time that Earp is believed to have shot a man while in Dodge.
It seems that 3 or 4 herders were paying their respects to the city and its institutions. and as is usually their custom, remained until about 3 o'clock in the morning when they prepared to return to their camps. They buckled on their revolvers, which they were not allowed to wear around town, and mounted their horses, when all at once one of them conceived the idea that to finish the night's revelry and give the natives due warning of his departure, he must do some shooting, and he commenced to bang away, one of the bullets whizzing into a dance hall nearby, causing no little commotion. Policeman Earp and Jim Masterson made a raid on the shootist, who gave them 2 or 3 volleys, but fortunately without effect. The policemen returned the fire and followed the herders with the intention of arresting them. The firing then became general. The herders rode across the bridge, followed by the officers. A few yards from the bridge, one of the herders fell from his horse from his weakness caused by a wound in the arm, which he had received during the fracas. The other herder made good his escape. The wounded man was properly cared for, and his wound, which proved to be a bad one, was dressed by Dr. McCarty. His name is George Hoy.
A few weeks later, the wounded man died. Although it was never entirely clear whose bullet killed George Hoy, Wyatt believed it was his. While Wyatt Earp was in Wichita and Dodge, his brothers were on separate paths that would also lead them to Tombstone. His older brother, Virgil, was in Dodge City at the same time as Wyatt, but it's not clear if he was ever on the marshal's or sheriff's force. But in October 1877, Virgil and his wife moved to Prescott, then the capital of the Arizona Territory. He earned the respect of the law enforcement there when he assisted the sheriff during a gun battle in the street.
The Weekly Arizona Journal-Minor. Shortly after his arrival here, and while Ed Bowers was sheriff of Ypsilanti County, the town was visited by 2 cowboys from the Bradshaw Basin section, who enlivened matters by shooting up saloons and other resorts, finally riding out of the place, shooting right and left as they went in the direction of the Brooks Ranch, just outside of the city limits. Arriving at the Brooks Ranch, the cowboys sent word to the officers that they were camped there, and if any of the officers wanted them to come out and get them. These men were considered bad ones and were known to be dead shots. Sheriff Bowers organized a posse of citizens, of which Virgil Earp happened to be one, and the posse started for the Brooks Ranch on horseback, preceded by Deputy United States Marshal Stanford and another deputy in a hack. The party in the hack passed the bad men unmolested, but the cowboys opened fire on the sheriff's posse, which was on horseback. Sheriff Bowers' horse was shot in several places, but he returned the fire and did not get hit. On arriving at the scene, Virgil Earp, who was armed with a Henry rifle, proceeded up the creek in the direction of the shooting and noticed one of the cowboys crouching under an oak tree, reloading his gun, shot and killed him instantly. The first shot hit him in the heart, and the second shot struck about 2 inches from the first. The other cowboy was shot with a charge of buckshot and lived for 2 days, finally dying in the hospital.
Not long after this incident, Virgil was elected constable of Prescott. A year later, he was also appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal for Eastern Pima County. Wyatt's younger brother, Morgan Earp, also worked as a lawman in Butte, Montana. He also worked as a shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo, a job that Virgil and Wyatt would take from time to time. Shotgun messengers were considered private lawmen, somewhat like Pinkerton agents. Wells Fargo agents would guard the company's strongbox, carried on a stagecoach, to discourage would-be robbers. Typically, Morgan would ride shotgun, sitting to the driver's left, cradling a sawed-off 10 or 12 gauge shotgun. In 1879, the town of Tombstone, Arizona, was established. The Earps began arriving that year. Virgil Earp was the first to move to Tombstone with his wife, Allie.
When Tombstone was discovered, I was in Prescott. The first stage that went out of Prescott toward Tombstone was robbed. Robberies were frequent and became expensive, and the disordered condition of the new country soon brought a demand for the better protection of business and money, as well as life. I was asked to go to Tombstone in my capacity as United States Marshal and went. The Tombstone country is of a particular character, the community being unsettled and dangerous. Most of the businessmen there stayed simply to make enough money to live somewhere else comfortably. And of course, the greatest object with them is to have as much money as possible spent in the town and to get as much of it as they can, careless of the means of dispensation or the results of the rough manners. Aside from the legitimate businessmen, the bulk of the residents are idle or desperate characters, most of them coming into town broke and depending upon the gambling tables or criminal ventures to supply them with the means of livelihood and dissipation.
As a deputy U.S. Marshal, Virgil Earp had a position that carried a fair amount of prestige, if providing little in the way of income. Virgil would have authority across a broader area than town marshals or county sheriffs, and he could coordinate larger operations with them. Wyatt and his common-law wife, Maddie, soon joined his brother.
In 1879, Dodge City was beginning to lose much of the snap which had given it a charm to men of restless blood, and I decided to move to Tombstone, which was just building up a reputation. Doc Holliday thought he would move with me. Big Nose Kate had left him long before. They were always a quarrelsome couple and settled in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He looked her up en route, and the old tenderness reasserting itself, she resolved to throw in her lot with his in Arizona. As for me, I was tired of the trial of a peace officer's life and wanted no more of it.
Despite Wyatt's wishes, he was soon working as a private law enforcement officer.
For the first 8 months, I worked as a shotgun messenger for Wells Fargo and Company, and beyond the occasional excitement of an abortive holdup attempt and a few excursions after cattle thieves and homicides in my official capacity, everything was quiet as the grave. Then the proprietors of the Oriental, the biggest gambling house in town, offered to take me into partnership.
Wyatt reported that the owners of the Oriental were having trouble with some rough customers who were trying to run them out of town. Wyatt's reputation, backed up by his physical presence, turned things around. But he also found another occupation at about the same time. 6 mules had been stolen from the U.S. Army Camp Rucker, 75 miles east of Tombstone. Lieutenant J.H. Hurst led a group of soldiers looking for these mules, and in Tombstone, he collected several men to assist him. Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan Earp, along with Wells Fargo agent Marshall Williams, went along. They followed the trail to the McLaury Ranch, along the Babakamari River.
After we arrived at McClary's ranch, there was a man by the name of Frank Patterson. He made some kind of a compromise with Captain Hurst. Captain Hurst come to us boys and told us he had made this compromise, and by so doing, he would get his mules back. We insisted on following them up. Hurst prevailed on us to go back to Tombstone, and so we came back. Hurst told us 2 or 3 weeks afterwards that they would not give up the mules to him after we left, saying that they only wanted to get us away, that they could stand the soldiers off. Hurst cautioned me and my brothers, Virgil and Morgan, to look out for those men, as they had made some threats against our lives.
The McClorys were members of a loosely organized criminal outfit called the Cowboys, who rustled cattle from ranches in Sonora, Mexico, and sold them in the U.S. They were also reputed to be involved in other crimes as well.
The Cowboys numbered at one time nearly 200. Most of them are what we call saddlers. living almost wholly in the saddle and largely engaged in raiding into Sonora and adjacent country and stealing cattle which they sell in Tombstone. It is rarely that any of these stolen cattle are recovered. When the thieves are closely pursued and it seems likely that they will be overhauled and the stock recovered, the Cowboys sell the cattle to some of the butchers practically in partnership with them. And I know of cases where the finest cattle in the country have been sold at $1 a head. When cattle are not handy, the Cowboys rob stages and engage in similar enterprises to raise money. As soon as they are in funds, they ride into town, drink, gamble, and fight.
One might expect that criminals such as the Cowboys would be universally reviled, but it was more complicated than that.
They spend their money as free as water in the saloons, dance houses, or faro banks, and this is one reason they have so many friends in town. All that large class of degraded characters who gather the crumbs of such carouses stand ready to assist them out of any trouble or into any paying rascality. The saloons and gambling houses, into whose treasuries most of the money is ultimately turned, receive them cordially and must be called warm friends of the Cowboys. A good many of the merchants fear to express themselves against the criminal element because they want to keep the patronage of the Cowboys' friends, and the result is that when any conflict between the officers and cattle thieves or stage robbers occurs, followed up by shootings around town, most of the expression of opinion comes from the desperado class and their friends. And the men who should speak loudest and most decisively to correct the condition of affairs are generally the quietest. An officer doing his duty must rely almost entirely upon his own conscience for encouragement. The sympathy of the respectable portion of the community may be with him, but it is not openly expressed.
Wyatt would soon discover that for himself. Not long after he helped track down the stolen army mules, Wyatt Earp was hired by Pima County Sheriff Charlie Chabelle. Wyatt was made a deputy sheriff of Tombstone, and since the sheriff was based in Tucson, Wyatt and a fellow deputy had a lot of freedom in Tombstone. It wasn't long before Wyatt was butting heads with the Cowboys again. On October 28, 1880, some cowboys were out shooting up the town near midnight.
Tombstone Epitaph, October 28, 1880. A lot of Texas cowboys, as they're called, began firing at the moon and stars on Allen Street near 6th. City Marshal Wyatt interfered to prevent violation of the city ordinance and was ruthlessly shot by one of the number. Deputy Sheriff Earp, who is ever to the front when duty calls, arrived just in the nick of time. Seeing the marshal fall, he promptly knocked his assailant down with a six-shooter and as promptly locked him up, and with the assistance of his brothers Virgil and Morgan, went in the pursuit of the others. The wound is serious, though not a fatal one. Too much praise cannot be given to the marshal for his gallant attempt to arrest the violators of the ordinance, nor to Deputy Sheriff Earp and his brothers for the energy displayed in bringing the malefactors to arrest. At last accounts, Marshal Wyatt was sleeping, and strong hopes of his ultimate recovery were expected.
Unfortunately, Marshal Wyatt did not survive the injury. The gunman in question was Curly Bill Brocious, a member of the outlaw Cowboy gang. After Marshal Wyatt's death, Wyatt Earp took Curly Bill to Tucson for trial. Wyatt testified as to what he saw that night.
I was in Billy Owen's saloon and heard 3 or 4 shots fired. Upon hearing light first shot, I ran out to the street and I saw the flash of a pistol up the street about a block from where I was. Several shots were fired in quick succession. I ran up as quick as I could, and when I got there I met my brother Morgan Earp. I asked my brother who it was that did that shooting. He said he didn't know, some fellows who ran behind that building. I asked him for his 6-shooter. After I got the pistol, I ran around the building. But before I got there, I heard Wyatt say, "I'm an officer. Give me your pistol." and just as I was almost there, I saw the defendant pull his pistol out of his scabbard, and Marshal Wyatt grabbed hold of the barrel of it. The parties were not more than 2 feet apart, facing each other. Both had hold of the pistol, and just then I threw my arms around the defendant to see if he had any other weapons, and looked over his shoulder, and Wyatt saw me and said, "Now you goddamn son of a bitch, give up that pistol." And he gave a quick jerk and the pistol went off. Wyatt had it in his hands, and when he fell to the ground shot, the pistol dropped and I picked it up. The defendant stood still from the time I first saw him until the pistol went off. When I took him in charge, he said, "What have I done? I have not done anything to be arrested for."
Before he died, Marshal Wyatt said he believed Curly Bill Brocious had shot him by accident. Wyatt's testimony that the marshal had jerked the barrel before it shot seems to support this. A gunsmith testified that there was a flaw in the gun, allowing it to be fired when half-cocked. Curly Bill was acquitted, but nonetheless, Wyatt hadn't made any friends among the cowboys. In the months ahead, the Earps and the Cowboys would clash again, with Wyatt's friend Doc Holliday throwing gasoline on the fire. At the same time, local politics would drive the issue even harder as a new sheriff came into town and seemed to align himself more with the Cowboys. It would all come to a head 1 year after Marshal Wyatt's death. On October 26, 1881, the Earps and Doc Holliday would stand together to face 4 cowboys. But the deaths that occurred there would be only the start, setting off a bloody feud that would leave casualties on both sides. Even Wyatt Earp would abandon law and order on his vendetta ride. And the Cowboys would see the dark fury of this particular lawman of the West.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.